Hello. This video is on Chapter 4, Participation in State Politics. And again, I'm going to focus your attention on some highlights for the chapter. So if you're with me on Chapter 4, it's somewhere around page 107 or 8. You can leaf through the chapter with me, make some notes, and we'll go from there. What does it mean to be participating in politics at the state level? Well, um, there's two ways of looking at this. How do citizens participate, and how do government officials participate? I want to focus on citizens. In another chapter, we're going to talk a little bit more about how state governments operate through making laws, judging the adequacy of laws, governing and implementing laws. But here I want to talk about how citizens participate. There's something the book talks about, points to, called sustained participation. If someone is involved with sustained political participation, they vote all the time. Every time there's a local, a state, or a national election, they're right there. They're in the front of the line. They're voting all the time. And that's referred to as sustained over time voting participation. However, generally speaking, if we were to state the percentage of people who participate in various elections, let's think about it this way. We have national elections, elections where presidents run for office. We have what we call off-year elections. That's where we have city, state, and local politics. And then there are local elections where we have people running for school board, or maybe local town commissioner, or we're voting on a budget for the schools and those kinds of things. So if we think about it in three levels, about 50% of those who could vote in the national elections. About 25% vote in the city and large city and state elections. That's where people run for office for state assembly. And about 10% of those who are eligible and capable of voting vote in the very local budgets, boards, and facilities kinds of very local elections. So as you can see, the level of participation for voting declines as we move from national, state to local. An interesting fact is that of all of the, if I were to ask you what is the best predictor of voting, if you looked at someone or a group of people, could you pick out that person who's most likely to vote? You would say to me, well, yeah, age is the best predictor of voting. So if someone is older, if you go into a room and you see a lot of people with gray, a whole lot of people, and you pick the people out with gray hair, they're more likely to vote. Age, education is a good predictor. Wealth, the wealthier the people are, more income they make, good predictor. More educated. Males typically vote more than on the average than females. People in the north vote more than the south. People in the south. People in cities vote more than people in rural areas and so on. But age seems to be the best predictor. Now, an interesting fact is when it comes to local elections, and I said earlier, only about 10% of the voting age population, votes in local elections for things like school budgets. When you have a lot of people who are older voting on school budgets, it's more likely they're not going to vote in favor because their children have already grown up. They've paid a lot of taxes, property taxes and school taxes, and they just don't see a need to be stacking those budgets. And so, interestingly, when it comes to school boards and school budgets, younger people who need budgets for their kids in school versus older people who vote more, the older people tend to set the agenda, and the younger people don't get the budget they need for their kids because they don't vote enough. And that's a good example of why voting is very, very important, why participation in state politics and in voting is extremely important. Is voting a rational process? The book talks about how rational it is. It's very rational if you think about it in terms of your input and the input of hundreds and thousands of other people voting has an impact. It has a direct impact on the kinds of people we put into office and the kinds of policy they set. So if you and I are very conservative fiscally, and we don't want a lot of policy where a lot of money is being expended in our budgets, then we vote for people who will set policy where there's less expenditure. It's a very rational process. However, there are other reasons why people vote because of civic pride, ideology. If we look at something like abortion politics, some people will vote, they'll go in and they'll vote for anybody who's against or for, depending upon their viewpoint, abortion. And that's all they care about. They don't care if the person is fiscally conservative or liberal or socially conservative or liberal. They just want that one policy area. Civic duty. Some people vote because they feel they must. They were in the war. They were patriotic. They were in the military. They grew up saluting the flag, and they feel very strongly about voting. They may not know what's on the agenda, who the people are, or what the voting process is, but they're going to vote because they feel it's a civic duty. So there are a lot of reasons, both rational and not so rational, why people vote. Now, when people vote during the voting process, we call that voter turnout, as the book talks about. Page 113, people who don't vote. Page 114 and beyond to 116, people who do vote, voter turnout. There's reasons why voter turnout, the numbers of people who turn out to vote, are high or low. Some of them, and most of them today, can be attributed to social economic reasons like education. I mentioned these before. Age certainly is the best predictor. Education, income, location, where in the country, what region of the country people are from. Also, there are legal reasons. I'm a political scientist, and I did not get the vote in the most recent local election here in Claiborne County. Why? I hadn't registered. Why? I didn't know I had to live here 30 days before I could register. So I should have voted in the location I lived before, but I didn't because I didn't know when I got here I was going to have a 30-day residency. So there are legal reasons that affect voter turnout, and barriers. History of the region has an effect on voter turnout. Back in the South, back in 100 years ago, persons who were African American could be lynched if they tried to vote. Even though there was no law against it post-Civil War, they wouldn't do it anyway because they knew a mob would grow and outside the voting booth, and when they came out, they'd get beaten up. So there's historical reasons why people don't vote. When the when the Irish first came to America in the 1870s, 1880s, and then another group in the 1910s and 20s, they lived in cities first, and they didn't vote typically because they felt they couldn't speak English, didn't understand the culture, and so they were laughed at, they were mocked, they couldn't get jobs, and so the Irish didn't vote for a long time until they became educated enough to recognize and understood the language enough to recognize that it was their right. So historically, there are reasons why we don't have as high a voter turnout as we could. I mean, you would think that 50% voter turnout for a presidential election, how does that compare to other nations? Well, if you take a look in the text, there's a table comparing us to other nations. There are some nations that have a holiday for voting, or they give time off from work, or they have a whole weekend. I mean, there are some African nations, and you've seen this on TV, where the lines are miles long because people see voting as their one chance to have an impact on freedom or on the lawmaking system. So voting becomes very powerful and very important in some places. It just, here, I think we've become a little bit lethargic in our reasoning for why we do or don't vote. There have been discriminatory practices that have been in place for a number of years. Discriminatory practices like Um, civil, polling taxes back in the latter part of the 19th century, particularly in the South. You had to pay an emolument, a couple of dollars, to vote, and that meant that people who were poor couldn't vote. And typically in the larger South, if you were black, you were likely poor. So there was a racial issue with poll taxes. Um, there's There was also the process where some persons had to fill out an application form in order to vote. And at the polling place, if someone who was African American came walking up the sidewalk to vote, they come in the door. They were given this 20-page application. On the other hand, right down the street at the white voting place, if a white person walked up the sidewalk, all they gave were given a little bit of a card to sign. So you see, discriminatory practices were in place in a lot of places, a lot of times in the South, unfortunately, and in some of the Midwestern states as you move toward the West. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, 24th Amendment, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Take a look at these in the book. They focus on on how we have, as a society, overcome and made illegal some of the voting practices that were in place. Also, take a look at affirmative action and gerrymandering in affirmative action. There's a case, Thornburg versus Gingles in 1986, where it was made allowable for particularly urban areas to create districts that were complementary to racial districts. So districts were allowed to be created in the process of redistricting in particularly urban areas where mostly minority group members lived, so that they would then be able to vote on and elect someone from their own background to get that person on city council, to have an impact and a voice for those who felt they were not having a voice in politics. The book talks about, the text talks about, chapter 4, women and participating in politics. It's only been recent history, where women have been inclined to be more involved in politics by either running for office or voting in larger numbers. And there's a couple of reasons for that. Some of political scientists feel that women were not participating mainly because of their role as mother and all the family responsibilities that go along with that. They didn't have time. Others feel that women have been socialized into more passive roles, so the competition of electoral politics didn't mean a lot to them. And it's only been in the last 20, 25 years where women have become more educated. In fact, there are more women in college today than there are men. And because of a lack of education and lack of background, they didn't feel inclined to know enough to be able to go out and compete in the voting process. So maybe some of those reasons are the case. Either way, it's not that way today. Take a look at page 129, table 4.3, and you'll see a comparison of women in politics and participating in politics today. There still is a gender gap, and the authors of chapter 4 talk about that as well. They also talk about a generational gap, and by that they're talking about how, again, age being the best predictor of participating in politics, either by running for office or voting for persons running for office. We have the older, what would be considered a wiser generation making the laws when most of the people are under 55 who are being affected by the laws. So is there a generational gap? Yes, in that sense there is. But we do live in a society that has a respect for older people having wisdom and experience to play the role of a policymaker and lawmaker. The text goes into a discussion about political parties and interest groups, and I would ask you to take a look at that. What do interest groups do? They're involved in public relations, campaign financing, and lobbying. take a look at lobbying. There's a whole discussion in the book about lobbyists and what they do. Are they illegal? No, for the most part, they're very legal, and they're very helpful to the political process and lawmaking in that they bring a lot of details and facts to lawmakers as lawmakers attempt to make law and policy. Something you might want to take a look at also in the text that mentions the most effective and successful protests have three elements. They have an effective interest group protest. They have a clear goal, specific legislation or some kind of a ruling that's trying to change, and they aim at a specific official or office. If one of those are missing, then a protest or interest group that's trying to get something done will have difficulty. So I say clear goal, specific legislation or rule that's trying to be changed or put in place, and they aim at a specific official or office. Okay, that wraps it up for Chapter 4, and we'll do Chapter 5 next. Thank you.